Some love stories begin with grand gestures and expensive gifts. This one began with 5 crumpled dollar bills and a heart that recognized its other half across a crowded room. Thomas Sander had exactly $7 to his name when he first saw her. The computer lab buzzed with the frantic energy of finals week, students hunched over keyboards like soldiers in trenches, fighting their academic battles with caffeine-stained determination. Thomas sat in the back corner, his third-hand laptop wheezing through another coding session, when the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen burst through the door. She wasn't beautiful in the polished way of the wealthy girls who populated his business classes, those perfectly groomed princesses who wouldn't look twice at a scholarship kid like him. No, Kelsey Robinson was beautiful in a way that hit him like lightning to the chest. Natural, radiant, completely unaware of her own magnetism as she searched desperately for an empty computer station. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the lab assistant with barely controlled panic in her voice. "My textbook was stolen from my dorm room last night. I need to access the digital library for my economics final tomorrow, but I can't afford the access fee until my work-study paycheck comes in Friday." Thomas watched her shoulders slump as the assistant shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, but the system requires payment up front. It's $25 for temporary access." $25. To most students here, that was pocket change. To students like Thomas, and apparently Kelsey, it might as well have been 25,000. He found himself standing before his brain could catch up with his heart. "Hey," he said, walking over to where she stood frozen in defeat. Up close, she was even more stunning. Not because of makeup or designer clothes, but because of the fierce intelligence burning in her dark eyes and the way she held her head high despite her circumstances. "I couldn't help but overhear," Thomas continued, pulling out his wallet with hands that trembled slightly. "I've got $5. It's not much, but maybe combined with whatever you have." Kelsey stared at him as if he'd just offered to move mountains. I have $15, but that's my food money for the week." "Mine too," Thomas said with a smile that felt like sunrise. "But knowledge feeds the soul, right? And I have a feeling you're the kind of woman who's going to change the world someday. Consider it an investment in the future." The lab fell silent around them as she looked into his eyes, seeing something there that made her breath catch. Kindness. Sacrifice. A recognition that passed between them like an electric current. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Thomas. Thomas Sander. Kelsey Robinson." She took the $5 with hands that shook. I don't know how to thank you." "Study with me," he said impulsively. "I mean, if you want. I'm here every night until they kick us out. We could help each other." That night, as closing time approached and the lab emptied around them, they remained bent over their respective assignments, stealing glances at each other over their screens. Thomas had never believed in love at first sight. It seemed like something from fairy tales, not real life. But watching Kelsey work, seeing the way she bit her lip in concentration and the way her face lit up when she solved a difficult problem, he felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "I'm starving," Kelsey admitted as they packed up their things. "I was going to grab something from the vending machine, but—" She gestured helplessly at her empty wallet. "I've got a sandwich back in my room," Thomas said quickly. "It's not much, just peanut butter and jelly, but we could share it." They walked across campus together, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Thomas's dorm room was a closet-sized space he shared with a roommate who was rarely there, probably off spending his parents' money at expensive restaurants and bars. "It's not the Ritz," Thomas said, suddenly embarrassed by the cramped quarters, the second-hand furniture, the stack of bills on his desk marked past due. "It's perfect," Kelsey said, and meant it. She sat cross-legged on his narrow bed while he retrieved the sandwich from his mini fridge, carefully cutting it in half with a plastic knife. They ate in comfortable silence at first, but as the night deepened, Words began to flow between them like water finding its course. They talked about their dreams, their fears, the weight of being the first in their families to attend college. Thomas told her about his vision of building a tech company that would revolutionize how people connected with each other. Kelsey shared her dream of creating something beautiful and meaningful, though she wasn't sure yet what form that would take. "You know what's funny?" Thomas said as they finished the last crumbs of their shared meal. "I've been so focused on my goal of making it big, of proving myself, that I forgot what it felt like to just connect with someone." "I know exactly what you mean," Kelsey replied softly. "I've been so busy trying to survive, trying to keep my grades up while working 3 jobs, that I forgot what it felt like to hope for something more." They were sitting closer now, the small bed making intimacy inevitable. Thomas could smell her shampoo, something inexpensive but clean and sweet. He could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the way her lips curved when she smiled. "Kelsey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know this is crazy and we just met, but I feel like you've been waiting for me your whole life," she finished, her eyes locked on his. "Yes, exactly like that." The first time their lips touched, it was tentative, questioning. But the second kiss was sure and deep and full of all the longing they'd both carried without knowing what they were longing for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I want to take care of you," he whispered. "I want to build something incredible and share it all with you." "I want to believe in your dreams," she whispered back. "I want to help you reach them." 2 weeks later, during another late-night study session, the power went out across campus. The computer lab plunged into darkness, filled with groans and complaints from students losing hours of work. But Thomas and Kelsey, sitting side by side as they had every night since they met, simply turned to each other and smiled. "I guess we're done studying for tonight," Kelsey said. "I guess we are." Thomas found her hand in the darkness, lacing their fingers together. "Want to go for a walk?" They wandered through the powerless campus, guided only by moonlight and the strange luminescence of snow that had begun to fall. Eventually, they found themselves at the small park near the library, completely alone in a world transformed by darkness and snow. "I love you, Kelsey Robinson," Thomas said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know it's too soon. I know we're broke and struggling and have no idea what the future holds, but I love you with everything I am." Kelsey's response was to kiss him with a passion that made the cold night disappear entirely. When they finally broke apart, her cheeks were wet with tears. "I love you too, Thomas Sander. I love your dreams, your kindness, your beautiful heart. I love how you gave me your last $5 without hesitation. I love how you see possibilities everywhere, even in the darkness." They made love for the first time that night in Thomas's narrow dorm room, their bodies learning each other by candlelight, their whispered promises creating a future that seemed as bright as the stars outside his window. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under his thin blanket, Kelsey traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "Tell me about our future," she murmured against his skin. "We're going to rule the world together," Thomas said, his arms tightening around her. "We're going to build something incredible, something that matters, and we're going to do it side by side no matter what obstacles we face." "Promise me," Kelsey said, lifting her head to look into his eyes. "Promise me that no matter how successful you become, no matter how much money you make or how famous you get, you'll never forget this moment. Promise me you'll never forget that I loved you when you had nothing." "I promise," Thomas said solemnly, sealing it with a kiss that tasted like forever. "You're my heart, Kelsey. My soul. My home. Nothing could ever change that." But as they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, neither of them could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Neither of them knew that Thomas's estranged family had been tracking his growing success, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim their prodigal son. And neither of them suspected that the greatest test of their love was about to begin. Chapter 2. building forever on nothing. The most expensive weddings often produce the shortest marriages, but Thomas and Kelsey were about to prove that love built on sacrifice lasts longer than empires built on gold. $200, Kelsey said, counting their combined savings for the third time, hoping the crumpled bills would somehow multiply in her hands. That's everything we have. Thomas looked up from his laptop, the same battered machine that had carried him through 4 years of college and was now running his fledgling app development business from their one-room apartment. The screen flickered ominously, another reminder of how precarious their situation truly was. It had been 18 months since that magical night in the computer lab. 18 months of shared struggles and dreams, of choosing love over comfort at every turn. They'd moved in together after Thomas's roommate graduated, pooling their resources to afford a tiny studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop. The space was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a kitchenette, but it was theirs. "It's enough," Thomas said firmly, standing up and crossing to where Kelsey sat on their second-hand bed, surrounded by wedding planning magazines she'd borrowed from the library. "We don't need a palace or 1,000 guests. We just need each other." "But Thomas, look at these dresses." Kelsey held up a magazine page showing a model in an elaborate gown that probably cost more than they made in 6 months. "Every girl dreams of feeling like a princess on her wedding day." Thomas gently took the magazine from her hands and set it aside, then cupped her face in his palms. Even after all this time, touching her still sent electricity through his fingertips. "You are a princess, Kelsey Robinson. You're my princess. And you'd look beautiful in a garbage bag, though I'm pretty sure we can do better than that with $200. She laughed despite her worries, leaning into his touch. "You always know exactly what to say." "I know exactly what I feel," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "And what I feel is that I want to be your husband more than I want my next breath. Everything else is just details." The next morning, while Thomas worked on debugging code for his latest client, Kelsey spread fabric samples across their small kitchen table. She'd found a pattern for a simple wedding dress at the library and calculated that she could make it herself for under $50 if she chose the right material. "What about this one?" she asked, holding up a piece of ivory silk that caught the morning light streaming through their single window. Thomas glanced over and felt his heart skip. Even holding the fabric sample, Kelsey looked radiant, her dark hair catching golden highlights, her eyes bright with excitement and determination. "Perfect," he breathed. "You're going to be the most beautiful bride in the world." But as the weeks passed and their wedding date approached, money grew even tighter. Thomas's laptop finally gave up the ghost 3 days before the ceremony, crashing in the middle of an important client presentation. "I can fix it," he said desperately, staring at the black screen. "I just need to replace the hard drive, maybe the graphics card." Kelsey watched him frantically searching repair websites, calculating costs they couldn't afford. She knew how much his work meant to him, how every client was a stepping stone toward the empire they dreamed of building together. Without a word, she walked to their small dresser and pulled out a jewelry box. The only valuable thing she owned, a gift from her grandmother before she passed away. "Kelsey, no," Thomas said, recognizing the box immediately. "You can't sell your grandmother's ring. It's all you have left of her." "What I have left of her is love," Kelsey said firmly, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold band set with tiny diamonds. "And she would want this love to help build our future. Besides, I'm going to have a much more important ring on my finger very soon." Thomas stared at her, overwhelmed by her sacrifice. Here was the woman willing to give up her most precious possession to help his dreams survive. He closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "No," he said. "If we're making sacrifices, we make them together." He picked up the laptop and walked toward the door. "This is going to buy your wedding ring. My dreams can wait a few weeks, but making you my wife can't wait another day." Thomas, you can't. Your business will survive because we'll build it together, stronger than before. But right now, the only thing that matters is becoming your husband. He sold his laptop that afternoon for enough money to buy 2 simple gold bands from a pawn shop downtown. They weren't diamond-studded or engraved with fancy inscriptions, but when Thomas slipped the ring onto Kelsey's finger that evening, it felt like the most precious treasure in the world. "With this ring," he said solemnly, even though they were just practicing in their tiny apartment, "I promise to choose you every single day, in good times and bad, when we're rich and when we're broke, when we're young and when we're old. You're my forever, Kelsey." The wedding itself took place on a crisp Saturday morning in November at the smallest chapel they could find, a tiny white building that charged only $50 for the use of their sanctuary. Kelsey had worked until 3 in the morning the night before, putting the finishing touches on her dress by candlelight to save money on electricity. As she walked down the narrow aisle with no father to escort her, no bridesmaids surrounding her, no expensive flowers decorating the simple altar, she felt more beautiful and more loved than any bride in history. Thomas stood waiting for her in his father's old suit, the only suit he owned, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he watched her approach. "You look," he whispered as she reached him, but words failed him entirely. "Like a woman who's about to marry the love of her life," Kelsey whispered back, her own eyes shining with joy. The ceremony was simple, but profound. When the pastor asked Thomas if he would take this woman to be his wife, his voice rang clear and strong throughout the small sanctuary. "I do. With every fiber of my being, with every dream in my heart, with every day I'm given to love her, I do." Kelsey's vows brought tears to the eyes of their 2 witnesses, Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs and Tommy, Thomas's study partner from college. "Thomas, you are my heart walking outside my body. I promise to stand beside you through every storm, to celebrate every victory, to love you when you're strong, and especially when you're weak. Forever isn't long enough, but it's all we have, and I give it all to you." When they were pronounced husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was gentle and reverent, full of all the promises they'd made to each other in the darkness of their tiny apartment. The reception was cake and punch in the chapel basement, but neither of them had ever tasted anything sweeter. That night, Thomas carried Kelsey over the threshold of their apartment, the same cramped space they'd been sharing for months, but somehow transformed by their new status as husband and wife. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sander," he whispered against her ear as he set her down gently. "Home isn't a place," Kelsey replied, her hands framing his face as she'd done so many times before. "Home is you. Home is us. Home is this love we've built together." Their honeymoon was 3 days of bliss in their one-room paradise. They made love with a new intensity, as if the wedding vows had unlocked something deeper between them. They survived on canned soup and saltine crackers, but Thomas fed Kelsey by candlelight as if she were dining on caviar and champagne. On their second morning as husband and wife, Kelsey woke to find Thomas sitting at their tiny kitchen table, writing in a notebook by the window's early light. "What are you doing, my love?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. "Writing you a letter," Thomas said, leaning back into her embrace. "I want to write you a love letter every morning for the rest of our lives. I want you to know, every single day, exactly how much you mean to me." Kelsey read over his shoulder, her heart swelling with each word. "My dearest wife, this morning I woke up and remembered that I get to love you forever. I remembered that you chose me when I had nothing to offer but dreams and determination. I want to spend every day proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. You are my strength, my inspiration, my reason for breathing. I love you more today than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow." "Your turn," Thomas said, handing her the pen. And so began their tradition. Love letters every morning, promises written in ink that no amount of wealth or success or family interference could ever erase. On their final honeymoon morning, as they lay tangled together in their narrow bed, Kelsey traced lazy patterns on Thomas's chest. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything," Thomas replied immediately. "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter how successful you become, no matter what challenges we face, no matter who tries to come between us, you'll never forget these days. Promise me you'll remember that we chose each other when we had nothing but love." Thomas lifted her chin so he could look directly into her eyes. "I promise you, Kelsey Sander, that I will choose you every single day for the rest of my life. No amount of money, no amount of success, no amount of pressure from anyone will ever change that. You are my anchor, my light, my home. Nothing could ever be more important than us." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like forever, neither of them knowing that in just 6 months, Thomas's revolutionary app would catch the attention of major investors, changing their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. And neither of them suspected that Thomas's wealthy family, who had ignored his existence for years, were already making plans to reclaim their heir. Chapter 3. Success and the Storm. 6 months later, Thomas stared at the number on his bank statement and felt his world tilt on its axis. But this time, it wasn't from love. $5 million. His simple messaging app, born from late-night conversations with Kelsey about connecting hearts across distances, had exploded overnight when a major tech blog featured it. Downloads flooded in by the hundreds of thousands, premium subscriptions soared, and suddenly venture capitalists were calling non-stop with offers that made his head spin. "Kelsey!" he called out, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Baby, you need to see this!" She emerged from their tiny bathroom, morning sickness evident in her pale complexion, but her eyes bright with curiosity. At 3 months pregnant, she'd been battling nausea for weeks, yet still insisted on working her part-time job at the local boutique to help support them during the app's development phase. "What is it, my love?" she asked, one hand instinctively resting on her barely there bump where their child grew. Thomas showed her the screen, watching her face transform from confusion to shock to pure, radiant joy. "Thomas, this is," she whispered, sinking onto their bed, the same narrow mattress where they'd shared their dreams and bodies for over 2 years now. "We did it. We actually did it." He lifted her carefully, spinning her around their cramped apartment with tears streaming down his face. "We're going to be okay, Kelsey. More than okay. We can get a real place, a nursery for the baby, everything we ever dreamed of." "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his neck, her own tears mixing with his. "I always knew you'd change the world." That evening, Thomas took her to their favorite diner, the same booth where they'd shared countless dreams over cheap coffee during their college years. But this time, he ordered champagne for himself and sparkling cider for Kelsey, his hands shaking with excitement as he raised his glass. "To us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To the baby. To the future we're going to build together." Kelsey lifted her glass, her wedding ring catching the diner's fluorescent light. "To the man who gave me his last $5 and ended up giving me the world." They were halfway through their celebration dinner, planning their move to a real apartment with a proper nursery, when Thomas's phone rang with a shrill tone that seemed to cut through their happiness like a knife. "Don't answer it," Kelsey murmured, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Tonight is ours." Thomas glanced at the screen and frowned. Unknown number with a Boston area code, the city where he'd been born but hadn't lived since he was 5 years old. "It might be another investor," he said apologetically. "Just give me 1 second." "Thomas Sander," he answered, still holding Kelsey's hand. The voice on the other end was crisp, cultured, and completely unfamiliar. "Thomas!" "It's your mother." The world stopped. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at Kelsey, who was watching him with growing concern. "I don't have a mother," he said slowly. "My mother died when I was 5. Don't be dramatic, darling. I'm Elizabeth Sander, and we need to talk. I've been following your recent success. Quite impressive for someone with your background." Thomas's free hand clenched into a fist. The Sander family had abandoned him when his father died, leaving a 5-year-old boy to be raised by distant relatives who could barely afford to feed him. He'd clawed his way through childhood and college on his own, creating his own family with Kelsey. "I don't know what you want, but I want to meet my son," Elizabeth interrupted smoothly. "And I want to meet the woman who thinks she's worthy of carrying a Sander heir." The possessive way she said Sander heir made Thomas's blood run cold. "My child isn't an heir to anything. This baby is going to be loved, not used. We'll see about that. I'm flying to your charming little city tomorrow. We have 20 years to catch up on." The line went dead, leaving Thomas staring at his phone in shock. "Thomas!" Kelsey's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Thomas, what's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "My family," he said numbly. "My biological family. They want to meet." Kelsey's face brightened with hope. "Oh, Thomas, that's wonderful. I know how much it's hurt you, not having them in your life. Maybe now that you're successful—" "No!" Thomas's voice was sharp, cutting through her optimism. "You don't understand. These people abandoned me when I had nothing. They only care now because I have something they want." But even as he said the words, part of him wondered. What if they'd been looking for him all these years? What if they genuinely wanted to reconnect? What if his child could have grandparents, aunts, uncles, a real family beyond just him and Kelsey? The next morning, Thomas paced their tiny apartment while Kelsey sat on the bed reading pregnancy books from the library. She'd been trying to lighten his mood all morning, sharing amusing facts about their baby's development, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change. "Listen to this," Kelsey said, trying to distract him from his worry. "It says here that our baby can already hear our voices. Maybe we should start talking to her." "Her?" Thomas paused in his pacing, a small smile breaking through his anxiety. "I have a feeling," Kelsey said, placing both hands on her stomach. "A mother's intuition. I think we're having a little girl." "What should we name her?" Thomas asked, sitting beside her on the bed. "Something beautiful. Something that means she's our miracle." Kelsey leaned against his shoulder. "What about charm?" "It means delight, fascination, something magical." "Charm Sander," Thomas repeated, feeling some of his tension ease. "I love it. She'll be our little charm, bringing us luck and joy." A sharp knock on their door shattered the peaceful moment. "That's her," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "That's my mother." He opened the door to reveal a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than their monthly rent. Elizabeth Sander was elegant, cold, and utterly out of place in their humble hallway. Behind her stood a tall man in an expensive coat, clearly her son and Thomas's half-brother. "Thomas," she said, her eyes scanning him from head to toe as if appraising merchandise, "you look like your father." "That's unfortunate." The man behind her stepped forward with a condescending smile. "I'm David, your brother. We've been looking forward to this reunion." Behind him, Kelsey rose from the bed, smoothing her simple maternity dress. Elizabeth's gaze shifted to her, and Thomas watched his mother's expression shift from cool assessment to barely concealed disgust. "And you must be the girl," Elizabeth said, not bothering to hide her disdain as she took in Kelsey's obvious pregnancy, their cramped apartment, the second-hand furniture. "I'm Kelsey Sander," Kelsey said firmly, extending her hand with dignity. "Thomas's wife." Elizabeth ignored the offered handshake entirely. "Yes, we need to discuss that unfortunate situation." She pushed past them into the apartment, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor as she surveyed their home with obvious distaste. David followed, his expression equally dismissive. "This is Quaint, Elizabeth said, the word dripping with condescension. I suppose it's adequate for your current circumstances, but things are going to change now. What do you mean? Thomas asked warily. Elizabeth turned to face them, her expression calculating. I mean that you're a Sander, Thomas. You come from one of the oldest, most respected families in New England, and now that you've proven you inherited the family intelligence, it's time you started acting like it. I'm acting exactly like myself, Thomas said firmly, and I like who I am. Do you? David interjected with a smirk. Do you like living in this hovel? Do you like watching your pregnant wife work retail while carrying your child? Do you like being nobody special? I am somebody special, Thomas replied, his arm tightening around Kelsey's waist. I'm her husband. I'm going to be a father. That's all the special I need. Elizabeth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How charmingly naive. But you see, Thomas, you're not just going to be a father. You're going to be the father of a Sander heir, and that comes with responsibilities you clearly don't understand. She turned her cold gaze to Kelsey, who had gone very pale. As for you, dear, I'm afraid we need to have a very serious conversation about whether you're suitable to raise a Sander child. The way she said suitable made Thomas's skin crawl, but before he could respond, Elizabeth was already walking toward the door. We'll be staying at the Grandview Hotel for the week, she announced, without looking back. Thomas, you'll join us for dinner tomorrow night, alone. We have so much to discuss about your real future. I won't go anywhere without my wife, Thomas said firmly. David paused at the door, his smile cruel. Oh, but you will, brother, because we have some very interesting information about your wife that you're going to want to hear. Information that might change how you feel about her motivations. When the door closed behind them, Thomas and Kelsey stood in stunned silence. Finally, Kelsey spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, they hate me. They don't even know me, but they hate me. Thomas pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him. But even as he held her, David's words echoed in his mind. What information could they possibly have about Kelsey? She'd been with him every day for over 2 years. What secrets could she possibly be hiding? For the first time since they'd met, a tiny seed of doubt planted itself in Thomas's heart. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder, what if his family was right? The war for their love had officially begun. Chapter 4. The Poison Spreads. The devil's greatest weapon isn't fire and brimstone, it's doubt whispered by people you're supposed to trust. 3 weeks had passed since Elizabeth and David's unwelcome visit, 3 weeks during which Thomas's app had grown into a $50 million empire. Investors were lining up, tech giants were making acquisition offers, and suddenly Thomas Sander was being featured on magazine covers as the next great American success story. But success, Kelsey was learning, came with a price neither of them had anticipated. You look tired, sweetheart, she said, watching Thomas stare at his laptop screen in their new penthouse apartment. Despite her protests, he'd insisted on upgrading their living situation immediately after Elizabeth's visit, claiming he wanted to provide properly for their growing family. At just under 4 months pregnant, Kelsey's bump was becoming more pronounced, and she'd taken to wearing flowing dresses that accommodated her changing body. She felt beautiful and radiant, but lately, Thomas seemed distant, distracted by something she couldn't identify. Just working through some investor meetings, Thomas replied without looking up. Elizabeth set up some connections with her business associates. The casual way he mentioned his mother's name made Kelsey's stomach clench with unease. Elizabeth had been calling daily since their confrontation, always with some urgent business matter that required Thomas's immediate attention. Each conversation left him more withdrawn, more troubled. Thomas, Kelsey said gently, settling beside him on their new leather sofa, a piece of furniture that cost more than their old apartment's yearly rent. Can we talk? Finally, he looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. There was something different there, something that hadn't existed before his family's reappearance. Suspicion. "Of course," he said, closing the laptop. "What's on your mind? You've been different lately. Since your mother started calling. I'm worried about us." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his knee in a nervous rhythm she'd never seen before. "Kelsey, can I ask you something? And I need you to be completely honest with me." "Always," she replied immediately. "You know that. When we first met, when you were struggling to pay for that textbook access, did you know who I was? Did you know about my family's wealth?" Kelsey felt as if he'd slapped her. "What?" "Thomas, what are you talking about? You didn't have any wealth. We were both broke college students. We shared sandwiches because neither of us could afford a full meal. But did you know about the Sander family fortune? Did you research me before we met?" The questions hit her like physical blows. "Thomas, I fell in love with a man who gave me his last $5, a man who sold his laptop to buy me a wedding ring. Where is this coming from?" Before Thomas could answer, his phone rang. Elizabeth's name appeared on the screen, and Kelsey watched her husband's face change as he answered. "Hello, Mother. Yes, I asked her. I see. Are you sure about that? Okay, I'll be there in an hour." He hung up and wouldn't meet Kelsey's eyes. "I have to go. Elizabeth wants to show me something important. Thomas, please, talk to me. What's happening?" But he was already grabbing his coat, leaving Kelsey alone in their expensive apartment, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a prison. An hour later, Thomas sat in Elizabeth's hotel suite, staring at a manila folder she'd placed on the coffee table between them. "I didn't want to show you this," Elizabeth said, her voice carefully modulated with false sympathy. "But as your mother, I have a responsibility to protect you." "What is it?" Thomas asked, though something in his gut was screaming at him not to look. "David's investigator did some research into your wife's background. Some very interesting things came to light." David leaned forward from his position in the suite's wing chair, his expression grave. "Thomas, we found evidence that Kelsey knew about the Sander family wealth before she ever met you." "That's impossible," Thomas said immediately. "We were both nobodies when we met. I didn't even know you existed." Elizabeth opened the folder with surgical precision. "These are screenshots from social media posts, Thomas. Posts where Kelsey discussed her financial struggles and her plan to find a wealthy husband to solve them." Thomas stared at the printed pages, his hands shaking. The screenshots appeared to show posts from Kelsey's college social media account, dated just weeks before they'd met. "Tired of being broke all the time? Maybe it's time to find a rich boyfriend, LOL. College is full of trust fund kids, right?" He read aloud, his voice hollow. "There's more," David said quietly. "Posts about targeting computer science students because they're most likely to become wealthy. Posts about the importance of getting pregnant early to secure a permanent connection." Thomas felt sick. This can't be real. Kelsey isn't like this. She's never cared about money. "Oh, my dear boy," Elizabeth sighed. "Of course she cares about money. Look how quickly she agreed to move into that expensive apartment. Look how she's already planning the nursery renovation that will cost more than most people's cars." "She didn't want the apartment," Thomas protested weakly. "I insisted. Because she manipulated you into thinking you needed to provide better for her," David interjected. "It's a classic gold digger technique. Make the man feel inadequate so he overspends to prove his worth." Elizabeth pulled out another document. "And this is a record of phone calls between Kelsey and her college roommate. Our investigator managed to obtain transcripts." Thomas read with growing horror. "I think I found my ticket out of poverty. This guy Thomas is brilliant, and his app is going to make him rich. I just have to make sure he falls hard enough that he'll want to marry me before he realizes he could do better." The words swam before Thomas's eyes. Everything he'd believed about their love story was crumbling around him. "This has to be fake," he whispered. "People don't fake phone transcripts and social media posts." "They do when they're protecting their son from a fortune hunter," Elizabeth said gently. "Thomas, I know this is painful, but you need to face the truth. This woman targeted you. She got pregnant deliberately to trap you, and now she's living in luxury while you work yourself to death to support her lifestyle." Thomas's mind raced through their relationship, reinterpreting every memory through this new, poisonous lens. Had Kelsey really been surprised by his success? Or had she been expecting it all along? Had her tears of joy been genuine or calculated performance? "But she loved me when I had nothing," he said desperately. "She loved your potential," David corrected. "She saw a smart, ambitious man who could be molded into her personal ATM. Look at the evidence, Thomas. It's all here in black and white." Elizabeth moved to sit beside her son, her voice taking on a motherly tone that Thomas had never heard before. "Sweetheart, I know this hurts. But think about it logically. What are the odds that a beautiful woman would fall instantly in love with a broke scholarship student? What are the odds she'd be willing to work multiple jobs to support his dreams unless she knew those dreams were going to pay off?" "She believes in me," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She believes in your bank account," Elizabeth replied sadly. "And now that you're worth $50 million, she's probably already planning her exit strategy. Mark my words, she'll find some reason to leave you and take half of everything you've built. The baby will ensure she gets child support for 18 years plus custody leverage whenever she needs more money." David's voice was clinical, matter of fact. "It's actually quite brilliant if you think about it objectively." Thomas stared at the document spread before him, his world tilting on its axis for the second time in a month. But this time, instead of joy, he felt only crushing betrayal. "I need to think," he said numbly. "Of course you do," Elizabeth said, rubbing his shoulder with false comfort. "But Thomas?" "Don't confront her directly. If she realizes you know the truth, she might disappear with the baby. We need to be strategic about this." "Strategic how?" "Let her think everything is normal while we build a case. Document her spending, her behavior, her attempts to isolate you from your real family. When the time comes, you'll have everything you need to protect yourself and your child from her manipulation." Thomas left the hotel in a daze, the manila folder tucked under his arm like evidence of his own stupidity. As he drove home to the penthouse apartment, he couldn't stop Elizabeth's words from echoing in his mind. What are the odds that a beautiful woman would fall instantly in love with a broke scholarship student? When he walked through the door, Kelsey looked up from the pregnancy book she'd been reading, her face lighting up with the same radiant smile that had first captured his heart in the computer lab. "How was your meeting?" she asked, and for the first time Thomas wondered if the warmth in her voice was genuine or calculated. "Fine," he said shortly. "I'm going to work in the study for a while." He saw hurt flicker across her face, but now he wondered if even that was performance. How long had she been playing this role? How long had he been nothing more than a mark in an elaborate con game? As he closed the study door behind him, Thomas Sander felt the first crack form in his heart. The poison Elizabeth had injected was already spreading through his bloodstream, killing the trust that had once made their love unshakable. And in the living room, Kelsey Robinson Sander sat alone, one hand resting on her growing belly, wondering why the man she loved more than life itself was suddenly looking at her like she was a stranger. The war for their love had entered its cruelest phase, and Kelsey didn't even know she was losing. Chapter 5. The Cruelest Betrayal. Some betrayals cut like knives, swift and sharp, but the cruelest ones burn slow, destroying you from the inside while the world watches and applauds. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers, and the laughter of 500 guests, all gathered to celebrate Thomas Sander's meteoric rise to the top of the tech world. At 8 months pregnant, Kelsey felt beautiful in the elegant maternity gown Thomas had chosen for her, a flowing emerald silk creation that made her feel like a queen despite her advanced pregnancy. "You look radiant," Thomas murmured as they entered the ballroom, his hand resting on the small of her back in the gesture that had always made her feel cherished and protected. But something in his touch felt different tonight. Distant. Kelsey had been trying to ignore the growing coldness between them for the past 4 months, hoping it was just stress from his business expansion. The Thomas she'd married would have spent the entire evening whispering jokes in her ear and stealing kisses when no one was looking. This Thomas barely glanced at her as they moved through the crowd. "Thomas!" Elizabeth's voice cut through the elegant chatter like a blade wrapped in silk. She glided toward them in a stunning silver gown, David close behind her in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. "My dear son, you look magnificent tonight." Elizabeth embraced Thomas warmly before turning to Kelsey with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Kelsey, how prominent you look this evening." The word prominent struck like a slap, making Kelsey instinctively place her hands over her rounded belly, where little Charm had been especially active today. "Thank you," Kelsey replied graciously, refusing to let Elizabeth's subtle cruelty dim her joy. "We're so excited about the baby. She's going to arrive soon." "Yes, we're all very interested in the timing of that," David said with a meaningful look at Thomas that Kelsey didn't understand. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and congratulations. Thomas was pulled from group to group, celebrated as the brilliant young entrepreneur who'd revolutionized social connectivity. Kelsey tried to keep up, but her advanced pregnancy made it difficult to navigate the crowded room in her heels. "Maybe I should sit down for a moment," she suggested during a brief lull in the festivities. "Of course," Thomas said, but his voice was mechanical, lacking the usual concern that would have had him immediately finding her the most comfortable chair in the room. Kelsey found a quiet corner where she could rest and watch her husband accept accolades from the tech world's elite. He looked so handsome in his tuxedo, so confident and successful. She should have felt proud, but instead a terrible unease was growing in her chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elizabeth's voice suddenly rang out across the ballroom as she approached the microphone on the small stage. "If I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted, turning toward Thomas's mother with polite interest. "As Thomas's family, we are incredibly proud of his achievements," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying perfectly through the sound system. "But we also believe that success should be built on truth, on authenticity, on genuine relationships." Kelsey felt a chill run down her spine. Something was very wrong. Which is why, painful as it is, we feel we must share some disturbing information that has recently come to our attention about Thomas's wife. The ballroom fell deadly silent. Kelsey felt hundreds of pairs of eyes turn toward her, and she struggled to breathe as panic constricted her chest. Elizabeth nodded to David, who stepped forward with a large screen that he'd wheeled onto the stage. "What you're about to see are photographs taken by a private investigator over the past several months." The first image that appeared on the screen made Kelsey's world explode into fragments. It was her, or appeared to be her, embracing a handsome stranger in what looked like an intimate moment. The image was so realistic, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment even Kelsey doubted her own memory. "As you can see," Elizabeth continued in a voice heavy with false sorrow, "Thomas's wife has been conducting an affair throughout her pregnancy." "No," Kelsey whispered, but her voice was lost in the shocked murmurs rippling through the crowd. More photos appeared, images of her apparently meeting the same man in restaurants, hotels, parks. Each one was a masterpiece of digital manipulation, so seamlessly created that they looked absolutely authentic. "We hired the investigator when we became concerned about her behavior," David added, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. What we discovered was that Kelsey Robinson targeted our brother specifically for his wealth potential, conducted an affair throughout their marriage, and may not even be carrying his child. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Kelsey tried to stand, to defend herself, but her pregnant body felt impossibly heavy, and the room was spinning around her. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice breaking. "Thomas, you know this isn't true. You know I would never—" But when she found her husband's face in the crowd, what she saw there destroyed her more completely than any photograph ever could. Cold, empty, full of disgust and betrayal. Thomas stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from his mother with steady hands. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to celebrate what I thought was the beginning of my future," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Instead, it's become the night I learned the truth about the woman I married." "Thomas, no," Kelsey pleaded, but her voice was just a whisper lost in the vast space. "Kelsey Robinson came into my life when I was nobody, when I had nothing," Thomas continued, his eyes finding hers across the room. "I thought she loved me. I thought we were building something beautiful together. I was wrong." Each word hit Kelsey like a physical blow. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the man who had whispered promises of forever against her skin, who had written her love letters every morning, who had chosen her over everything else in the world. "The evidence is clear," Thomas said, gesturing to the screen still displaying the doctored photographs. "She targeted me for my potential wealth, manipulated me into marriage, and has been deceiving me throughout our entire relationship." "That's not true." Kelsey finally found her voice, struggling to her feet despite her advanced pregnancy. "Thomas, how can you believe this? You know me. You know my heart." The room turned to stare at her as she moved toward the stage, her emerald gown flowing around her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I love you. I've loved you since the moment we met. I would never betray you, never hurt you. Those photos are fake. They have to be fake." Thomas looked down at her from the stage, and when he spoke, his voice was colder than winter frost. "You'll never be part of this family again," he said, each word precisely enunciated, designed to cut as deeply as possible. "Leave before I regret ever loving you." The words shattered something fundamental inside Kelsey's chest. The pain was so intense, so complete, that she felt her body responding in ways beyond her control. "Thomas!" she gasped, doubling over as a sharp cramp tore through her abdomen. "Thomas, the baby! Something's wrong!" But he had already turned away from her, accepting congratulations from his brother as if she no longer existed. Another cramp, stronger this time, dropped Kelsey to her knees on the ballroom floor. Warm liquid soaked through her beautiful emerald gown, and she realized with terror that her water had broken. "Please!" she cried out to the crowd of elegant strangers surrounding her. "I need help. The baby's coming." Several women moved toward her, but Elizabeth's voice cut through their attempts at assistance. "Don't!" she commanded sharply. "This is obviously another manipulation attempt. She's not really in labor." But Kelsey was in labor, her body racked with premature contractions brought on by the emotional trauma of her public humiliation. She crawled across the marble floor toward the stage where Thomas stood with his back to her, desperately reaching for the man she loved. "Thomas, please," she sobbed. "Our baby charm is coming. I need you." He glanced down at her with disgust. "Call security," he said to David. "Have her removed from the premises." "Sir, I think she really is in labor," one of the hotel staff said, kneeling beside Kelsey as another contraction racked her body. "Then call an ambulance," Thomas replied coldly, "but I won't be going with her. I have no interest in raising another man's child." As security guards approached and paramedics were called, Kelsey lay on the cold marble floor of the ballroom, her emerald gown stained with fluid and tears, watching the man she loved celebrate her destruction with 500 witnesses. Through her pain, she heard Elizabeth's voice on the microphone. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this unpleasant scene, but sometimes the truth is messy. Now, let's continue celebrating my son's incredible success." The crowd began to disperse, stepping carefully around Kelsey as if she were debris that would soon be cleaned up. She reached one final time toward the stage where Thomas stood surrounded by well-wishers, but he never looked back. As the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, Kelsey whispered to her unborn daughter, "I'm sorry, Charm. I'm so sorry your daddy couldn't see the truth." And in the ambulance racing toward the hospital, as premature labor tore through her body, Kelsey Robinson Sander realized that the man she'd pledged her forever to had just destroyed both their lives in front of 500 strangers. The greatest love story she'd ever known was ending in the cruelest way possible, not with honest failure, but with calculated public humiliation designed to break her spirit completely. But what Thomas Sander didn't realize, as he accepted champagne toasts and congratulations on his narrow escape from a gold digger, was that he had just thrown away the only real love he would ever know. And someday, when the truth finally came to light, the memory of this night would haunt him forever. Chapter 6. Rising from Ashes. Sometimes the greatest strength is born in the moments when you have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Kelsey Robinson held her newborn daughter against her chest in the sterile hospital room, completely alone except for the tiny miracle breathing softly against her heart. Charm had arrived 3 weeks early, a fighter from the very beginning, her small fists clenched with determination that seemed to mirror her mother's newly forged resolve. "Just you and me, baby girl," Kelsey whispered, tears streaming down her face as she studied her daughter's perfect features. Charm had Thomas's nose and chin, but her eyes, when they briefly fluttered open, were all Kelsey's. Dark and expressive, already seeming to hold wisdom beyond her hours of existence. The divorce papers had been served that morning by a lawyer who couldn't meet her eyes, along with a restraining order that prevented her from contacting Thomas or coming within 500 feet of any Sander property. Elizabeth's final cruelty, ensuring that Kelsey left the hospital with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby who would never know her father. "Mrs. Sander?" A kind-faced social worker entered the room, her voice gentle but professional. "I'm Patricia Williams. I understand you'll need some assistance with housing arrangements." Kelsey's heart clenched. She had nowhere to go. The penthouse apartment had belonged to Thomas, her few personal belongings probably already discarded. Her family lived across the country and couldn't afford to help, even if she'd been willing to burden them. "There's a women's shelter about 15 minutes from here," Patricia continued. "They have space for you and the baby. It's clean, safe, and they have programs to help new mothers get back on their feet." Pride warred with practicality in Kelsey's chest. A shelter. She was about to become homeless with a newborn baby. But as she looked down at Charm's sleeping face, pride lost the battle. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We'll need the help." The New Beginnings Women's Shelter was a converted Victorian house painted cheerful yellow with a small garden out front and the sound of children's laughter drifting from the playground behind the building. Kelsey's room was tiny, just large enough for a single bed, a crib, and a small dresser, but it was clean and warm, and most importantly, it was theirs. "You're not the first woman to end up here after a bad marriage," said Rosa, the night supervisor, as she helped Kelsey settle in, "and you won't be the last. But I can tell just by looking at you, you're going to be one of the success stories." For the first 3 months of Charm's life, Kelsey survived on government assistance and the kindness of the shelter's staff and residents. She spent her days caring for her daughter and her nights planning their future. Other women came and went, some finding their footing and moving on, others caught in cycles of dependence and despair. But Kelsey refused to be broken. I'm going to make something of our lives, she whispered to Charm during those long, quiet nights. I'm going to show you that a woman can be strong, that love doesn't make us weak. I'm going to build us a kingdom, baby girl, and no one will ever be able to take it away from us. When Charm was 4 months old, Kelsey took her first job, cleaning offices at night while her daughter slept in a portable bassinet beside her. The work was hard and the pay minimal, but it was honest labor that didn't require her to depend on anyone else's charity. "Look at you, little one," she murmured, as she mopped floors in the gleaming corporate towers where Thomas's former peers worked during the day. "Mommy's showing you that dignity comes from doing whatever it takes to build our future." Within 6 months, Kelsey had saved enough to rent a tiny efficiency apartment. It wasn't much, a studio space with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette, but it was theirs. She hung pictures on the walls and bought second-hand furniture, creating a home filled with love, even if it lacked luxury. As Charm grew from infant to toddler, Kelsey's cleaning business grew too. Her clients praised her attention to detail, her reliability, her honest nature. Word spread, and soon she was cleaning homes as well as offices, building a reputation for excellence that transcended her humble circumstances. "Mama work," Charm babbled from her high chair one morning as Kelsey prepared to leave for a client's house. At 18 months old, Charm was already showing signs of her parents' intelligence, speaking in full sentences and observing everything with those thoughtful, dark eyes. "That's right, sweetheart. Mama works so we can have nice things and you can go to good schools someday." "Daddy work too?" Charm asked with the innocent curiosity of a child who didn't understand the complexities of adult relationships. Kelsey's heart stopped for a moment. She'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. "Daddy is building his own dreams," Kelsey said carefully. "But you and Mama, we're building our dreams together. And that makes us very special." It was the first of many such conversations, each one breaking Kelsey's heart a little more. But she never spoke badly of Thomas to their daughter. Whatever pain he'd caused her, Charm deserved to form her own opinions about her father someday. By the time Charm turned 3, Kelsey's cleaning business had evolved into something more. Wealthy clients began asking her advice about home organization, about interior arrangements, about creating spaces that felt both elegant and livable. What started as casual suggestions became formal consultations, and Kelsey discovered she had an eye for design that transformed ordinary spaces into extraordinary sanctuaries. "I think you should consider interior design school," suggested Mrs. Harrison, one of her regular clients, whose mansion Kelsey had been quietly reorganizing for months. "You have a gift, dear. It would be a shame not to develop it properly." Kelsey enrolled in night classes while Charm slept, studying by lamplight in their tiny apartment, sketching designs on whatever paper she could afford. Her professors were amazed by her natural talent and her fierce determination to succeed. "You work harder than students half your age," Professor Martinez told her after she presented a room design that left the class speechless. "But more than that, you understand that interior design isn't about expensive furniture. It's about creating emotional connections to space. That can't be taught." When Charm turned 5, Kelsey graduated with honors and launched Robinson Interiors. Her first real client was a young couple who'd seen her work at Mrs. Harrison's house. They couldn't afford much, but Kelsey transformed their small home into something magical, using creativity and resourcefulness instead of expensive materials. The before and after photos went viral on social media. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hire the interior designer who could create luxury looks on modest budgets, who understood that beautiful homes were built with love and vision, not just money. "Mama famous," Charm announced one morning, pointing to her mother's picture in the local newspaper's lifestyle section. "Not famous, baby. Just working hard and getting noticed for it." But Kelsey was becoming famous, at least in their city. Her client list grew to include celebrities, politicians, and business executives. She hired assistants, rented office space, and started turning down projects because she couldn't keep up with demand. Through it all, she remained devoted to charm, attending every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game. She bought a house, not a mansion, but a beautiful Victorian that she renovated herself, creating a home filled with warmth and laughter. "Why don't you have a boyfriend, Mama?" 10-year-old Charm asked one evening as they cooked dinner together in their sun-filled kitchen. Kelsey paused in her chopping of vegetables, considering her answer carefully. The truth was that she'd been asked out many times over the years. Clients, suppliers, even other parents at Charm's school had expressed interest, but none of them had ever made her heart skip the way it had for Thomas all those years ago. "I have you," she said finally. "You're the love of my life, Charm. Everything else is just extra. But don't you get lonely?" Kelsey looked at her daughter, brilliant, compassionate, strong-willed and beautiful, and smiled. "How could I be lonely when I have the most amazing daughter in the world?" What Kelsey didn't know was that across the city, in a glass tower overlooking the business district, Thomas Sander sometimes stood at his office window and wondered about the child he'd rejected. He'd heard through business contacts that his ex-wife had become quite successful, that she'd built a design empire from nothing. Sometimes late at night, when the guilt and loneliness became unbearable, he would drive past Charm's school and catch glimpses of a dark-haired girl who had his jawline and his mother's eyes. But he never approached, never tried to make contact. Elizabeth had made sure of that, reminding him constantly that the child probably wasn't even his, that Kelsey had undoubtedly moved on to other wealthy men, that he was better off focusing on his business empire instead of dwelling on past mistakes. But on the day Charm won the citywide science fair at age 12, Thomas was there in the back of the auditorium, watching his daughter accept her trophy with pride that made his chest ache. She was brilliant, confident, everything he'd hoped his child would be. And when Kelsey joined Charm on stage, beaming with maternal pride in a simple but elegant dress, Thomas felt something break inside his chest. She was still beautiful, still radiant, but there was a strength in her bearing now that hadn't been there before. She'd survived his betrayal and built something extraordinary from the ashes of their destroyed love. He left before the ceremony ended, driving home to his empty mansion with tears streaming down his face, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. But by then, it was far too late for apologies, and much too late for forgiveness. Chapter 7. The Hollow Crown. Success without love is just an expensive way to be miserable. Thomas Sander stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 50th floor, staring down at the city he'd conquered but couldn't feel. At 36, he was worth $2 billion, owned properties on 3 continents, and commanded an empire that employed thousands of people. His face graced magazine covers monthly, his opinions moved markets, and his name was synonymous with visionary leadership. He was also the loneliest man alive. 12 years had passed since that terrible night at the Meridian Hotel, 12 years since he'd destroyed the only woman who had ever truly loved him. In all that time, Thomas had thrown himself into work with an obsession that bordered on madness, building his fortune higher and higher, as if money could somehow fill the void where his heart used to be. It couldn't. "Sir?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your mother is here for your lunch meeting." Thomas closed his eyes, steeling himself for another encounter with Elizabeth Sander. The woman who had saved him from a fortune hunter had become the architect of his misery, though he was only beginning to understand the true cost of her intervention. Elizabeth swept into his office like a queen claiming her throne, impeccably dressed in designer clothing paid for with his money, her smile sharp and satisfied. "Thomas, darling," she purred, settling into the leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. "You look tired. You're working too hard again." "I'm fine," he replied automatically, the same response he'd given to everyone's concerns for years. "Of course you are. You're a sander. We don't break under pressure. Elizabeth's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. I have wonderful news. David has found you the perfect match. Miranda Ashford from the Philadelphia Ashfords. Old money, excellent breeding, and she's already expressed interest in meeting you. Thomas felt his stomach turn. For the past 5 years, Elizabeth had been orchestrating a parade of suitable women through his life. Daughters of business associates, socialites, heiresses, all perfectly groomed, perfectly boring, perfectly wrong. I'm not interested in dating right now, he said, the same words he'd repeated countless times. Thomas, you're 36 years old. You need a wife, an heir, someone who can stand beside you in society, someone who understands your position. Someone who understands my position, Thomas repeated slowly. You mean someone who wants my money? Elizabeth's laugh was like crystal breaking. Of course they want your money, darling. That's how our world works. At least these women are honest about their motivations, unlike that little gold digger who tried to trap you years ago. At the mention of Kelsey, something twisted painfully in Thomas's chest. He'd spent 12 years trying not to think about her, but lately the memories had been forcing their way to the surface with increasing frequency. Mother, can I ask you something? Certainly, dear. Those photographs you showed me of Kelsey, how did your investigator get them so quickly? The affair supposedly went on for months, but you hired him only days before you had evidence. Elizabeth's smile didn't waver, but Thomas caught something flickering behind her eyes. Professional investigators work fast when they know what they're looking for. And the social media posts? The phone transcripts? What are you getting at, Thomas? For the first time in 12 years, Thomas looked directly at his mother and asked the question that had been buried under layers of guilt and self-doubt. Were they real? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Elizabeth's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something Thomas had never seen before. Panic. Of course they were real, she said quickly. Thomas, why are you bringing up this ancient history? That woman is long gone. You've built an empire since then. Why dwell on past mistakes? But Thomas was already moving toward his private elevator, his mind racing with a clarity he hadn't felt in over a decade. Where are you going? Elizabeth called after him. To fix the biggest mistake of my life, he replied, and the elevator doors closed on his mother's shocked face. 20 minutes later, Thomas sat across from Michael Torres, the tech security specialist who'd helped him build his empire's cyber defenses. I need you to analyze these, Thomas said, sliding the manila folder across the desk, the same folder Elizabeth had shown him 12 years ago. Michael examined the photographs and documents with professional thoroughness, running them through sophisticated analysis software that hadn't existed when Thomas first saw them. These are fakes, Michael said without hesitation. Very good ones for their time, but fakes nonetheless. The metadata has been altered, the images show clear signs of digital manipulation, and these social media posts were backdated. Someone went to considerable trouble and expense to create false evidence. Thomas felt the world tilt on its axis for the third time in his life. But this time, instead of joy or betrayal, he felt something far worse, the crushing weight of irreversible loss. How long would it have taken to create all this? Months of planning, maybe longer. This wasn't a rush job. Someone orchestrated an elaborate deception. Thomas drove home to his Beacon Hill mansion in a daze, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. The house was a monument to his success. 30 rooms filled with priceless art and furniture, but empty of any warmth or love. He walked through the silent halls like a ghost haunting his own life. In his study, he pulled out a box he hadn't opened in 12 years. Inside were the love letters Kelsey had written him during their marriage. The ones Elizabeth had claimed were manipulative lies designed to keep him under her spell. With adult eyes and a cleared mind, Thomas read them again. My dearest husband, I woke up this morning thinking about how lucky I am to be building this life with you. Not because of your success or your money, but because of your beautiful heart. I would love you just as much if we lived in that tiny apartment forever, eating canned soup and dreaming our dreams together. You are my home, Thomas, my safe harbor, my greatest adventure. Forever yours, Kelsey. The words hit him like physical blows. Every letter was filled with genuine love, with specific memories of their life together, with hopes and dreams that had nothing to do with material wealth. How had he ever believed they were calculated manipulations? His phone rang, Elizabeth's name appearing on the screen. Thomas, where did you go? We need to talk about Miranda. You destroyed my life, he said quietly. What? The evidence, the photographs, all of it was fake. You hired people to create false evidence so I would believe Kelsey was unfaithful. The silence on the other end was deafening. Thomas, you're being ridiculous. 12 years, he continued, his voice gaining strength. 12 years I've lived with the guilt of what I thought she did to me. 12 years I've been building this empire, thinking it would somehow fill the hole you created when you made me throw away the only real love I've ever known. She was going to destroy you. Elizabeth's mask finally dropped completely, revealing the calculating monster beneath. She was nobody, Thomas. A scholarship student from a broken family who would have held you back from your true potential. She was everything, Thomas whispered. She was my heart, my soul, my reason for breathing. And you murdered our love with lies. I saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life. No, Thomas said, looking around his empty, soulless mansion. You made me make the biggest mistake of my life. You made me choose this hollow existence over real happiness. He hung up the phone and walked to his computer, pulling up the web browser he rarely used for personal searches. Robinson Interiors, he typed, his hands shaking. The website that loaded showed a thriving design business, award-winning projects, and at the center of it all, a photograph of Kelsey. She was older now, her face showing the wisdom that came from surviving hardship, but she was still breathtakingly beautiful. Still the woman who had loved him when he was nothing. He clicked through to news articles about her success, interviews where she discussed her design philosophy, charity work she did for women's shelters. In every photograph, she radiated the same warmth and intelligence that had captivated him in that college computer lab. Then he found what he'd been searching for without realizing it, a photograph of charm. His daughter was accepting an academic award at her high school, her dark hair shining under stage lights, her smile bright with intelligence and determination. She had Kelsey's eyes but his stubborn chin, and something about her posture reminded him painfully of himself at that age. The caption read, Charm Robinson, valedictorian of Lincoln High School's graduating class, will attend Stanford University in the fall on a full academic scholarship. Thomas stared at the screen until tears made it impossible to see clearly. His daughter, brilliant, accomplished, beautiful, bore her mother's name because he had been too poisoned by lies to claim her as his own. He had missed everything. First steps, first words, first days of school, graduations, heartbreaks, triumphs. 12 years of loving a child who probably didn't even know he existed, who had grown up believing her father hadn't wanted her. The weight of his loss was so crushing that Thomas couldn't breathe. He had traded a life filled with love, laughter, and meaning for an existence of material success and emotional emptiness. He had let his mother's poison convince him to destroy the only real happiness he'd ever known. And now it was too late. Far too late. Kelsey had built a life without him, raised their daughter to be extraordinary despite his abandonment, succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams through her own talent and determination. She had moved on, as she should have. While he had spent 12 years in exile from his own heart, living in a prison of his mother's making, convincing himself that success could substitute for love. That night, Thomas Sander sat alone in his mansion worth $50 million, surrounded by possessions that meant nothing, and wept for the family he had thrown away. The irony was crushing. In trying to protect his fortune, he had lost the only treasure that actually mattered. And somewhere across the city, Kelsey Robinson tucked their daughter into bed in their warm, laughter-filled home, never knowing that the man who had destroyed them was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his betrayal. But understanding, Thomas realized with devastating clarity, was very different from being able to undo the damage he had caused. Some mistakes were simply too large to be forgiven, and some losses too profound to be recovered. He had gained the whole world and lost his soul, and now he was finally awake enough to feel the full agony of what that trade had cost him. Chapter 8. When everything crumbles. Sometimes God has to break us completely before we can see what we've become, and by then it's usually too late to change anything but our hearts. 5 years after discovering the truth about Elizabeth's deception, Thomas Sander sat in Dr. Patricia Wong's office, staring at test results that would have destroyed a weaker man. But Thomas had already been destroyed by his own choices. This was simply the final blow in a series of devastating realizations. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sander," Dr. Wong said gently, her voice carrying the weight of delivering life-altering news. "The cardiomyopathy is quite advanced. Your heart muscle has deteriorated significantly, likely due to prolonged stress and what you've described as chronic insomnia and poor self-care over many years." Thomas nodded numbly. Since learning about his mother's lies, he hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. The guilt and regret had been consuming him from the inside, and apparently his body was finally giving up the fight. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Without a heart transplant, which your age and overall health make unlikely, I'd estimate 6 to 8 months, I'm sorry." Thomas walked out of the medical building into the crisp autumn air, feeling strangely calm. Death, it seemed, would be a release from the prison of his own making. At least in dying, he might finally find peace from the constant ache of missing Kelsey and Charm. But first, he had to face the consequences of 12 years of hollow success. The news of his terminal diagnosis spread through his company like wildfire, and Thomas watched with detached fascination as his carefully built empire began to crumble. Business partners who had fawned over him for years suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. Investment deals fell through, stock prices plummeted as rumors of his condition leaked to the press. "We need to discuss succession planning," his board of directors informed him during an emergency meeting. "The company's stability depends on a smooth transition." Thomas looked around the conference table at men and women he'd considered allies, even friends, and saw only calculating opportunists positioning themselves to benefit from his downfall. "I understand," he said simply. Within a month, he'd been forced out of his own company by a hostile takeover orchestrated by his former business partners. His financial advisors, who had managed his wealth for years, suddenly discovered irregularities in their investment strategies that would require extensive legal proceedings to resolve. Lawsuits materialized from nowhere. Properties he'd owned for years became entangled in legal disputes. The fortune he'd spent over a decade building evaporated with stunning speed, but the cruelest blow came from his own family. "Thomas, darling," Elizabeth said, her voice sickeningly sweet over the phone, "David and I have been discussing your situation. We think it would be best if you signed over power of attorney to us, to protect the family assets during this difficult time." "Family assets," Thomas repeated slowly. "You mean the money I earned while you enjoyed the benefits of my success?" "Don't be dramatic. We're trying to help you. The same way you helped me 12 years ago when you destroyed my marriage with lies." The silence that followed was filled with years of unspoken manipulation finally coming to light. "That woman would have ruined you," Elizabeth said finally, her mask slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. You needed to marry within your class to build proper connections. I saved you from making a terrible mistake. You saved me? Thomas laughed bitterly. Mother, you destroyed the only real happiness I ever had. You made me abandon the woman who loved me and the daughter who should have known her father. You turned me into a lonely, empty shell of a man who mistakes money for meaning. At least you're wealthy, Elizabeth snapped, her pretense of maternal concern finally dropping entirely. At least you achieved something significant instead of throwing your life away on some nobody from nowhere. I achieved nothing, Thomas said quietly. I built a fortune I can't take with me, and an empire that doesn't care if I live or die. Meanwhile, Kelsey built a life filled with love and meaning. She raised our daughter to be extraordinary. She succeeded in every way that actually matters. That's enough, Elizabeth said sharply. If you won't sign over power of attorney willingly, we'll have you declared incompetent. The medical records will support our case. The line went dead, and Thomas realized with crystal clarity that his own family was preparing to rob him blind while he was dying. Within weeks, Elizabeth and David had initiated legal proceedings to have Thomas declared mentally unfit due to his terminal diagnosis. They hired lawyers to argue that his disease had affected his judgment, that he needed family members to manage his affairs for his own protection. Thomas found himself living in a modest apartment, the only property Elizabeth's legal maneuvering hadn't yet managed to freeze, watching his life's work being dismantled by the very people who had profited from his success for years. You look terrible, David said during one of his rare visits, surveying Thomas's humble surroundings with obvious disgust. This place is barely better than that hovel you lived in with your gold-digging wife. Get out, Thomas said quietly. Oh, come now, brother. I'm just being honest. You're dying, your money is disappearing into legal fees, and you're living like a pauper. Was it really worth it? All that pride, all that stubbornness about signing over power of attorney? Thomas looked at his half-brother, a man who had never worked for anything in his life, who had lived off Thomas's success while contributing nothing, and felt something close to pity. David, when I die, what will you remember about me? That you were too proud for your own good, David replied immediately. And when Kelsey dies, what will Charm remember about her? David shrugged, not understanding the question. She'll remember a mother who loved her unconditionally, Thomas continued, who worked 3 jobs to support her dreams, who built a business empire while never missing a school play or soccer game, who taught her that strength comes from character, not bank accounts. He stood up, his deteriorating heart making the simple movement an effort. You and Elizabeth taught me that success without love is meaningless. Kelsey taught our daughter that love with purpose can overcome any obstacle. Which lesson do you think matters more? David left without answering, but Thomas knew he'd struck a nerve. That night, alone in his small apartment, Thomas did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He wrote a letter to Kelsey. My dearest Kelsey, I know I have no right to contact you after what I did. I know my words can never undo the pain I caused or repair the damage to our family. But I need you to know that I finally learned the truth. The evidence my mother showed me was fabricated. Every photograph, every document, every proof of your supposed betrayal was an elaborate lie designed to separate us. I was a fool to believe it, and an even bigger fool to hurt you the way I did. I have spent 12 years in exile from my own heart, building an empire of money and possessions that turned to dust the moment I understood what I'd really lost. You were my home, my anchor, my reason for breathing. You still are. I'm dying, Kelsey. My heart is failing, which seems appropriate since I broke it myself when I chose lies over love. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that not a single day has passed without me regretting the choice I made in that ballroom. Tell Charm, our beautiful, brilliant daughter, that her father loved her even when he was too broken to show it. Tell her that her mother is the strongest, most incredible woman who ever lived, and that she should be proud to carry the Robinson name. I'm sorry, my love, for everything. I would trade every dollar I ever made for one more day in our tiny apartment, sharing sandwiches and dreaming impossible dreams together. Forever yours, even in death, Thomas. He sealed the letter but couldn't bring himself to send it. What good would it do except cause her more pain? Instead, he researched everything he could find about Charm's college plans, her academic achievements, her future goals. Through social media and news articles, he watched his daughter prepare to leave for Stanford University, brilliant and confident and beautiful. She was valedictorian of her graduating class, editor of the school newspaper, and had already been accepted into Stanford's advanced business program. In interviews, she spoke eloquently about her desire to create companies that would help people connect authentically, words that echoed dreams Thomas had shared with her mother in another lifetime. The irony was devastating. His daughter was following in his footsteps while bearing her mother's name, achieving everything he'd hoped for while having no idea he existed. On the day of Charm's high school graduation, Thomas sat in the back of the auditorium again, hidden among hundreds of proud parents and family members. Kelsey sat in the front row, radiant with maternal pride, clapping enthusiastically as their daughter delivered a valedictorian speech about perseverance and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. "My mother taught me that success isn't measured in dollars or possessions," Charm said, her young voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we give, and the legacy we leave behind. She showed me that a woman can be strong and gentle, ambitious and nurturing, successful and humble all at the same time." Thomas wept silently as his daughter praised the woman he'd abandoned, describing Kelsey as her hero and role model. When the ceremony ended and families gathered to congratulate their graduates, Thomas slipped away into the parking lot. He never saw Kelsey notice him leaving, never saw the way her face paled as she recognized the silhouette of the man she'd once loved more than life itself. That night, Elizabeth called with the news Thomas had been expecting. "The courts have ruled in our favor," she announced triumphantly. "You've been declared incompetent to manage your affairs. David and I now have full power of attorney over your remaining assets." "Congratulations," Thomas said calmly. "I hope you enjoy spending money I earned while you were busy destroying my life." "Oh, we will. And Thomas, don't bother trying to contact us again. As far as the Sander family is concerned, you're already dead." She hung up, leaving Thomas alone with the sound of his failing heart and the weight of absolute solitude. But as he sat in the gathering darkness, Thomas realized something profound. Losing his fortune had been liberating. Without money to distract him, without business pressures to consume his time, he could finally see clearly what had always mattered most: love, family, connection, purpose, everything he'd thrown away in pursuit of hollow success, everything Kelsey had kept while building a meaningful life from the ashes of their destroyed dreams. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find the courage to face the woman he'd wronged, not to ask for forgiveness, that was beyond hope, but to finally tell the truth and perhaps in some small way begin to repair the damage his choices had caused, even if it was 12 years too late, even if he was dying, even if she could never love him again. Some debts, he was learning, could only be paid with the currency of complete honesty and unconditional surrender, and Thomas Sander was finally ready to spend everything he had left. Chapter 9. You're my only hope. The journey to redemption begins with a single step, even when that step requires crawling on your hands and knees across a city that no longer knows your name. Thomas Sander woke up on the floor of his small apartment, his chest feeling like someone had wrapped steel bands around his ribs and was slowly tightening them. The morning light filtering through his cheap curtains seemed impossibly bright, and it took him several attempts to push himself up to a sitting position. 3 weeks had passed since Elizabeth and David had legally stripped him of everything. 3 weeks of watching his body deteriorate while his heart, both the physical organ and the metaphorical center of his being, prepared to give up entirely. But today felt different. Today felt like his last chance to do something meaningful before the darkness claimed him completely. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone book he'd kept hidden in his desk drawer. Robinson Interiors had an address listed, a converted Victorian mansion in the historic district that served as both Kelsey's business headquarters and, according to recent real estate articles he'd found online, her family home. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been accumulating empty mansions and meaningless possessions for 17 years, Kelsey had created a home filled with purpose and love. Getting dressed required 3 rest breaks. The simple act of pulling on his clothes left him breathless and dizzy, but Thomas forced himself to continue. He had to reach her today, while he still had enough strength to make the journey. The walk to the bus stop took 40 minutes instead of the usual 10. Thomas had to stop frequently, leaning against lampposts and building walls as waves of weakness washed over him. Several people offered to call an ambulance, but he waved them away. This was something he had to do alone. The bus ride across the city felt endless. Thomas sat in the back, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by while he fought to keep breathing steadily. A teenage girl with dark hair and intelligent eyes got on at one stop, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought it might be charm. But when she turned, her face was unfamiliar, and Thomas remembered that his daughter was probably already at Stanford, beginning her freshman year. Another milestone he'd missed, another moment of her life that had passed without him. When the bus reached the historic district, Thomas pulled the stopcord with hands that shook from more than just physical weakness. The short walk from the bus stop to Kelsey's address should have taken 5 minutes. It took him nearly an hour. The Victorian mansion that housed Robinson Interiors was breathtaking. 3 stories of restored architectural beauty, painted in warm colors that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. The gardens were immaculate, and through the large windows, Thomas could see elegant interior spaces that spoke of both professional success and personal warmth. This was the life Kelsey had built from the ashes of their destroyed love. This was the empire she'd created not through manipulation or lies, but through talent, determination, and the kind of authentic character Thomas had thrown away 12 years ago. A brass plaque beside the front door read, "Robinson Interiors, creating spaces for life's most beautiful moments." The slogan made Thomas's chest constrict with something deeper than his heart condition. Even in her professional life, Kelsey focused on beauty, on meaning, on helping others create the kind of love-filled spaces he'd never learned to appreciate. Thomas made it halfway up the front walkway before the next wave of weakness hit him. This one was different, stronger, more final. He stumbled, catching himself on one knee, then both knees, his vision graying at the edges. Not yet, he pleaded with whatever force controlled such things. Just let me reach her door. Let me tell her the truth before I go. Crawling the final 20 feet to Kelsey's front door was the most difficult thing Thomas had ever done. Not because of the physical pain or the humiliation of being seen on his hands and knees by passing pedestrians, but because every inch brought him closer to facing the woman whose life he'd destroyed. What right did he have to appear at her door after 12 years of silence? What possible good could come from dredging up their painful past when she'd clearly moved on and built something beautiful without him? But as his failing heart struggled to pump blood through his deteriorating body, Thomas realized that this wasn't about what he deserved or what might be comfortable for either of them. This was about truth, about a debt that needed to be paid before he died, about giving Kelsey the closure she'd been denied when he'd believed his mother's lies and thrown away everything that mattered. The front steps seemed impossibly steep. Thomas pulled himself up each one, his dress shirt torn from the crawl across concrete, his hands scraped and bleeding. Somewhere behind him he could hear voices, people expressing concern, offering help, but their words seemed to come from very far away. Finally, he reached the heavy oak door with its beautiful stained glass panels. Thomas collapsed against it, his chest heaving as he fought to draw enough breath to speak. Through the glass, he could see movement inside, someone approaching the door, probably drawn by the commotion he'd caused. With the last of his strength, Thomas raised his fist and knocked. The door opened, and suddenly she was there. Kelsey, 12 years, had only enhanced her beauty. There were tiny lines around her eyes now, laugh lines, worry lines, the marks of a life fully lived. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and she wore a simple but expensive dress that spoke of success achieved through her own efforts. She looked like exactly what she'd become, a woman who had survived betrayal and built something extraordinary from the ruins. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Thomas saw shock flicker across her face, followed by recognition, then something that might have been pain or anger or a complex mixture of both. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He tried to speak, but no words came. His body was shutting down, his vision blurring, his chest feeling like it was being crushed by invisible weights. But her face, her beautiful, strong, familiar face, remained perfectly clear. "Kelsey," he managed to gasp, the single word requiring tremendous effort. I need to tell you." But before he could finish the sentence, the world tilted sideways and Thomas felt himself falling. He was dimly aware of Kelsey crying out, of her hands trying to catch him as he collapsed completely on her doorstep. As consciousness fled, Thomas used every remaining ounce of strength to speak the words that had brought him across the city on his hands and knees. "You're my only hope." Then darkness claimed him, and Thomas Sander lay broken and dying on the threshold of the only woman who had ever truly loved him, his fate resting entirely in her hands. From somewhere very far away, he heard Kelsey's voice, not the cold, angry tone he'd expected, but something else. Something that sounded almost like the woman who had once whispered promises of forever against his skin in a tiny apartment above a flower shop. "Oh, Thomas," she was saying, and there were tears in her voice. "What have you done to yourself? What have we both done?" He felt her hands touching his face, checking his pulse, and even in his unconscious state, some part of him recognized the tenderness in her touch. After 12 years of exile from love, Kelsey Robinson was the last face he saw before the darkness took him. Whether he would live to see her again, whether she would choose to save him or let him face the consequences of his choices alone, remained entirely up to the woman whose heart he had shattered, but who might perhaps still remember what they had once meant to each other. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between consciousness and oblivion, between his past mistakes and whatever future might be possible, Thomas Sander surrendered completely to the mercy of the only person who had ever made his life worth living. His only hope lay in her hands now, and somewhere in the depths of his failing heart, he found peace in knowing that if these were to be his final moments, at least he would spend them in the presence of true love, even if that love could never be his again. Chapter 10. The greatest love story ever told. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something eternal, something that proves the human heart is capable of miracles, even in the darkest moments. Kelsey knelt beside Thomas's unconscious form on her front porch, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse and felt the irregular, fluttering beat of a heart that was giving up. For 12 years, she had imagined what she would do if she ever saw him again. Sometimes she'd fantasized about slamming the door in his face. Sometimes she'd dreamed of demanding explanations, but she had never imagined this. Thomas broken, dying, collapsed on her doorstep like a wounded animal seeking shelter. "Call 911, she told Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor who had rushed over when she saw the commotion. "Should I call his family too?" Mrs. Patterson asked, pulling out her phone. "He doesn't have family," Kelsey replied automatically, then caught herself. I am his family. I'll handle this." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. After 12 years of raising their daughter alone, After building a life from the wreckage of his betrayal, why was her first instinct still to protect him? But as she looked down at Thomas's gaunt face, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been strong and confident, she saw not the man who had publicly humiliated her, but the boy who had given her his last $5 in a computer lab, the young husband who had sold his laptop to buy her a wedding ring, the father who had never known his daughter but whose eyes charm had inherited. The paramedics arrived within minutes, working efficiently to stabilize Thomas before loading him into the ambulance. As they prepared to leave, one of them turned to Kelsey. "Are you family?" "We'll need someone to handle medical decisions if he can't." Kelsey looked at the man she had loved more than life itself, now unconscious and fighting for every breath. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm his wife." The words felt strange on her tongue after 12 years, but legally they were still married. Thomas had never filed for divorce after that terrible night, perhaps too consumed with building his empire to bother with the paperwork. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Thomas's appearance had already told her. He was in end-stage heart failure, his body shutting down after years of stress, neglect, and the crushing weight of guilt that had consumed him since learning the truth about his mother's deceptions. Without a miracle or a heart transplant that his condition made nearly impossible, he had weeks at most. "I'm sorry, Doctor," Martinez said gently. "Is there anyone we should contact? Other family members?" "No," Kelsey replied firmly. "There's no one else." She stayed by his bedside that first night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady beep of machines that were keeping him alive. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, his eyes fluttered open. "Kelsey?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," she said, surprising herself by reaching out to touch his hand. Thomas stared at her as if she were a vision, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "You came," he whispered. "You actually came." "You collapsed on my doorstep," she pointed out, but her voice was gentle. "Where else would I be? I thought, after what I did, you'd let me die alone." Kelsey was quiet for a long moment, studying the face that had haunted her dreams for 12 years. He looked so different now, not just physically diminished by illness, but somehow younger, more vulnerable. The arrogance and coldness that had characterized him during their final encounter were completely gone. "Thomas," she said finally, "why did you come to my house? After all this time, why now?" His grip tightened slightly on her hand, and she could see the tremendous effort it took for him to speak. "Because I found out the truth," he said, "about the photographs, about the evidence my mother showed me. All of it was fabricated, Kelsey. Every single piece of it was a lie." The words hit her like physical blows. For 12 years, she had wondered what could have possibly convinced Thomas that she was capable of betrayal. She had assumed it was his own ambition, his desire to fit into his wealthy family's world. She had never imagined that he had been systematically deceived. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. With tremendous effort, Thomas told her everything. Elizabeth's manipulation, the fake social media posts, the doctored photographs, the years of isolation and guilt he had endured while building an empire that meant nothing without her to share it. "I hired a tech specialist to analyze everything," he gasped between labored breaths. "He proved it was all fake, professional quality deception planned for months. My mother, she destroyed us, Kelsey. She destroyed our family because she thought you weren't good enough for the Sander name." Kelsey sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he was telling her. All those years of wondering what she had done wrong, of protecting charm from the truth about her father's abandonment, of building strength from the assumption that Thomas had simply chosen wealth over love. "She hired actors," Thomas continued, his voice growing weaker. "She created false evidence. She made me believe you had married me for money when you were the only person who ever loved me for who I really was." "Thomas," I know it doesn't change anything, he interrupted, tears streaming down his face. I know I can't undo the damage I caused. But I needed you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. I've spent 12 years in exile from my own heart because I threw away the only real happiness I ever had. Kelsey felt her own tears beginning to fall. The anger she had carried for so long was cracking, revealing the love she had tried so hard to bury. You have a daughter, she said softly. A brilliant, beautiful daughter who looks like you and thinks like you and has your stubborn determination to succeed. She's at Stanford now, planning to study business because she wants to build companies that connect people, just like her father dreamed of doing. Thomas closed his eyes, his whole body shaking with sobs. Charm, he whispered. I missed everything. Her childhood, her achievements, her dreams. I missed the chance to be her father because I believed lies instead of trusting love. She doesn't know, Kelsey admitted. I told her you were building your own dreams. I never said you abandoned us. Thomas opened his eyes and stared at her in amazement. Why? Why would you protect me after what I did? Because she didn't deserve to grow up thinking her father didn't want her, Kelsey replied simply. And because somewhere deep down, I knew the Thomas I married wouldn't have walked away from his family unless something was terribly wrong. They talked through the night, really talked for the first time in 12 years. Thomas told her about the hollow success, the empty mansions, the business partners who had abandoned him the moment his health failed. Kelsey shared stories about Charm's childhood, her achievements, the moments when she would ask about her father, and Kelsey would have to choose between truth and kindness. As dawn broke through the hospital windows, Thomas made a request that broke Kelsey's heart. I want to go home with you, he said. Not to my apartment. That's not home. Home is wherever you and Charm are. I know I don't deserve it, but could I spend whatever time I have left trying to be the man you both deserved? Kelsey stared at him for a long moment, seeing past the physical deterioration to the soul she had fallen in love with in a college computer lab. Yes, she whispered, you can come home. The next week, Thomas moved into the guest room of the Victorian mansion that housed Robinson Interiors. It was strange having him there, this ghost from her past suddenly corporeal again, needing help with simple tasks, grateful for every kindness she showed him. But strangest of all was how right it felt. Charm came home from Stanford the following weekend, and Kelsey's heart nearly stopped as she watched her daughter meet her father for the first time in 12 years. You're Thomas Sander, Charm said, studying him with intelligent eyes that were so much like his own. I'm your father, Thomas replied quietly, though I know I haven't earned that title. Mum told me you were building your dreams, Charm said carefully. She never said you didn't care about us. I cared about you every day, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I was just too broken to show it, but I see now that you turned out perfectly anyway, because you had the most extraordinary mother in the world. Charm looked between her parents, this dying man who was a stranger, but somehow familiar, and her mother whose eyes were bright with tears. Are you here to stay? She asked Thomas. For as long as your mother will have me, he replied, which probably won't be very long. Good, Charm said simply. I've always wanted to know my father. What followed were the most precious months of Thomas's life. He was too weak to do much physically, but he filled his remaining time with love, real love, the kind he had forgotten existed during his years of hollow success. He attended Charm's video calls from Stanford, helping her with business plans and listening to her dreams with the pride of a father who had finally learned what mattered. He sat with Kelsey in her design studio, watching her work and marveling at the empire she had built through talent and determination rather than manipulation and lies. Most importantly, he loved them both with the desperate intensity of a man who knew his time was running out. I'm sorry, he told Kelsey one evening as they sat together in the garden behind her house. For all of it. for believing the lies, for hurting you, for missing Charm's childhood. If I could trade everything I built for one more year with you both." "Thomas," Kelsey interrupted gently, "I forgave you the night you collapsed on my doorstep. The moment I saw you broken and alone, I knew that whatever had happened between us, love was stronger than pride or anger or even betrayal." "How?" he whispered. "How can you forgive something that destroyed so many years?" "Because love doesn't end," she said simply. "It gets buried sometimes, hidden under pain and misunderstanding. But it doesn't die. What we had was real, Thomas. The lies couldn't change that, and neither can time." 3 months after his collapse, Thomas's condition took a turn for the worse. The family doctor, Kelsey, insisted on calling them a family now, said it would be days, not weeks. Thomas spent his final conscious hours surrounded by love. Charm had come home from Stanford, taking a leave of absence to be with her father. She held one of his hands while Kelsey held the other, both of them telling him stories about their life together, filling his last moments with the family he had almost lost forever. "Thank you," he whispered to Kelsey as his breathing became more labored. "Thank you for being my forever, even when I didn't deserve it." "Always," she whispered back, kissing his forehead, "in this life and whatever comes after." Thomas Sander died as the sun set on a Tuesday evening in March, surrounded by the two people he loved most in the world. His last words were a whisper so soft that only Kelsey heard them. "Now I know what real success looks like." 6 months later, Kelsey and Charm stood together at Thomas's grave, not as bitter survivors of his abandonment, but as the women who had loved him enough to offer redemption in his darkest hour. "Do you think he's at peace now?" Charm asked, placing fresh flowers on the headstone that read simply, "Thomas Sander, beloved father and husband." "I think he found peace the moment he chose love over pride," Kelsey replied. "He spent the last months of his life learning what he should have known all along, that the greatest success isn't what you build for yourself, but what you build with the people you love." As they walked away from the cemetery, Charm slipped her arm through her mother's. "Mum, I'm glad you took him in. I'm glad I got to know my father before he died." "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." And in that moment, Kelsey Robinson knew that their story, hers and Thomas's and Charm's, was indeed the greatest love story ever told. Not because it was perfect, but because it proved that love could survive betrayal. Forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds, and redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to crawl to the door of the person they had wronged and surrender everything to their mercy. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't have fairy tale endings. Sometimes they have something even better, the kind of ending that proves the human heart is capable of miracles.